Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming out tonight. Thanks to Skip for that introduction. I wasn't sure if he was going to tell that story today or not tell that story. He saved me from having to reprise at least part of it. It's a tribute to his good humor and open-mindedness that he would invite me to come speak here, given the grief that I caused him about 8 years ago. It is true that that story was, I continued to get people call me about it for 4 years after I wrote it because they shut off the computer. It was the only place you could go to find out who had been listed for some time as the top donors of the Clinton Library. So every so often you luck into something, and that was one where I lucked into it. I remember, I was telling Skip earlier, trading off with various members of the Little Rock and broader Arkansas community that had come for the first day. The library was, I think, fully open the day after the dedication ceremony. And indeed, they were all trying to see where their pavers were that they had paid for in the garden or the plaza in front of the library. And I was trying to write down the donors, so I tried to be not a rude out-of-towner. I would pause every so often and let them come up and jot down the number for their paver. Then I'd get back in line and start writing down the names of various Saudi princes and Middle Eastern sheiks. Anyway, so from that humorous note to a more serious subject, so while I do cover the White House and I do work for Politico, my basic area that I cover at the moment is largely national security and foreign policy issues. I cover legal issues in the Justice Department as well, and obviously the national security foreign policy side of that is a little more timely today than I think any of us would have expected in light of the events that happened yesterday in Egypt and also in Libya. So I thought we might start by talking, I might start by talking a little bit about that and how foreign policy and national security issues have played out in a kind of unexpected way in the campaign. People have probably seen what's happened in the last 24 hours, the back and forth between President Obama and Governor Romney in the wake of the death of the U.S. ambassador to Libya and at least 3 other Americans who were over there involved in diplomatic work. It's almost immediately become an issue in the campaign. As some of you may know, Governor Romney's campaign put out a statement late last night saying that it was disgraceful what the U.S. Embassy in Cairo had initially said in response to the beginning of this incident when there were promises of demonstrations at the embassy and consulates over as I understand it, not an actual film, but the trailer for a forthcoming film that is anti-Muslim in nature and led to a lot of negative reaction from people in the Muslim world. It was kind of surprising to me how quickly it became an issue of combat in the presidential campaign. My assessment of that is that I think that the Romney campaign feels that they're behind. They're a few points behind, and we're getting pretty late in the game. It's only 57 or so days till Election Day, and there's a lot of reluctance on their part to just let an entire day, an entire news cycle go without them participating in it in some way. They kind of took the day off yesterday in large part because it was the 9/11 anniversary. We had thought that Governor Romney was going to make a more detailed statement about his policy in Afghanistan and how it's distinct from the policy President Obama is pursuing. He chose not to do that yesterday, but they were just raring to go with this statement about the embassy situation at midnight last night. Perhaps in retrospect raring too quickly because the situation was still unfolding, and the governor today, former governor, kind of doubled down on his earlier comments and said that he didn't regret any of them, although I don't think he used the word disgraceful when he went in front of the television cameras today. We saw also President Obama come out and make a statement on camera, and just within the last few hours he's also done an interview with CBS talking about this in some more detail. We can probably discuss that more later if people are interested in the questions, but I thought it was an interesting way of getting into this whole national security foreign policy issue in the campaign. And what has always struck me as one of the most surprising aspects of this campaign that President Obama enjoys such an advantage over Governor Romney, the Republican, on the issue of national security. As someone who's kind of covered those issues for the last 3.5, 4 years, I've kind of watched that situation evolve, and I think it's fair to say that no one who was watching it closely in 2009 and 2010 would have predicted that this area would be an advantage for President Obama at this point in the re-election campaign. The hope in the White House was that it wouldn't be a real liability for him, but I don't think anybody thought that it would be something where he would actually be able to mock his opponent's experience or lack of experience at the Democratic Convention, as President Obama did just a few days ago. Just to retrace some of the history, in 2009, we had a lot of controversy about President Obama's promise to close the Guantanamo Bay Detention Center for terrorism suspects. It was an issue that was immediately set upon by Republicans in Congress who vowed to block it, and it was one where polls showed at that time that about 2/3 of Americans agreed with the Republicans that it shouldn't be closed, or at least that the people there shouldn't be moved to the United States. Continued to be an area where the president had trouble with traction through 2009. Also, you saw towards the end of 2009 the bombing attempt on the U.S. airliner headed for Detroit, which caused a lot of concern about whether the administration or the law enforcement community was up to handling these issues, and how the administration responded. The fact that the suspect was read his Miranda rights when many people saw it as more of a military attack that ought to be dealt with that way. And then the third sort of checkpoint here in this early period of the Obama administration was the effort to try the 9/11 suspects who are currently at Guantanamo Bay in New York City, which was something the president had kind of hinted at in the campaign, not necessarily committed to, but a lot of his supporters in the legal community thought that he had given pretty firm signals that he would be using the civilian justice system and not the military justice system or military commissions to try terrorism suspects. So this became a huge issue of controversy in 2009 and 2010. And again, it was another area where Congress moved to block the president from having his way. It's kind of interesting to note that while the polls showed there wasn't a lot of support for the president's positions on these particular issues, there was a considerable debate about why that was. Some people said they're inherently unsellable, that no Americans were interested in having terrorists or accused terrorists jailed down the street from them at the local state prison, even if security was beefed up. And others said that the president really hadn't made an effort to try to sell the policy to Americans, that when you really want to do something, you give speeches about it, you send out your surrogates to talk about it. And that's something that the Obama administration never really did. The president made a speech about these issues in May of 2009, and as someone who's been asking the White House questions about them for the last 3 years, I can tell you they constantly refer back to his speech at the National Archives in May of 2009. That, as much as anything, confirms to me that they never really made a full college try to try to convince people on these policies. Why didn't they do that? We have some hints about why. Rahm Emanuel, who was the chief of staff at the White House at that time, and who is now the mayor of Chicago and embroiled in a different controversy, is reported to have said at a staff meeting at the White House in 2009 or 2010, I'm trying to land 2 747s at the same time, and you keep flying a flock of birds or a flock of geese in between them. This is supposedly a comment that he made to Attorney General Holder about the Guantanamo situation. The 2 747s were supposed to be, to resolve the stimulus legislation or to fix the problems with the economy and to deal with the health care bill. And Rahm Emanuel was of the view that this Guantanamo issue and the related terrorism issues were not something worth investing a lot of the president's capital in, and so it wasn't ever really invested. And Attorney General Holder was not really allowed to go out and make a full case. Whether that case would have ever succeeded, I don't know. It's sort of an unknowable unknowable question at this point. And then over the course of those 2 years, Congress kept sending down legislation to the president that was increasingly sort of hostile to his goals on those issues. And in pretty much each and every instance, the president signed that legislation somewhat grumpily with some protests to the point where now he basically doesn't really have the authority to close Guantanamo. So then how do we get to this point where the president enjoys, according to many opinion polls, a 10 to 17 point advantage over Governor Romney on national security issues? I mean, the most obvious thing, obviously, would be the bin Laden raid in May of 2011 that the president okayed and authorized and to some extent directed, which really began to turn things around for him on this issue. It was such a high-profile event, pulled in a lot of people that probably don't pay a lot of attention to these issues, and there was a big rally around the commander-in-chief feeling to that. The White House also did some things to try to, I think, exploit that, some of which has come back to haunt them a little bit. There have been allegations that they leaked information that was classified or that they shouldn't have put out in their haste to capitalize politically on the bin Laden raid. It's certainly true. I don't know whether they leaked things that were classified or not. To some degree, the president is the one who decides what's classified, so he sort of has the authority to put out information if he chooses to do so. But there's no question that in the days right after the raid, the White House was a lot more eager than other parts of the government, to publicize aspects of that operation. We saw sort of hasty and confusing briefings that were presented by the White House in the couple of days after that raid. And those briefings were made despite objections apparently from Defense Secretary Robert Gates, who said at the time that he had been assured on the day of the raid or the day after the raid that there wouldn't be any more detailed briefings beyond one that was given the night that it happened. And in fact, there were a whole series of them, and details have continued to come out. And obviously now we have even members of the SEAL team that carried out that raid writing books about it. So that was probably the seminal event in turning around the president's fortunes, on the national security and foreign policy front. There were other things, and part of it is largely his giving up on the policies that he laid out before on Guantanamo. He basically surrendered on that issue. He eventually, after a lot of back and forth over the period of about a year, gave up on the idea of terror trials in New York City, and that was essentially abandoned, and the suspects that were going to be sent there for trial are now in the beginning of a trial process at Guantanamo Bay. And then the other part of this that has turned it around for him on this issue and sort of disarmed Republicans is, of course, his use of this very aggressive tactic of drone strikes to take out terrorism suspects. I won't say all over the world, but in a lot of different parts of the world. It's not limited to just Afghanistan or Pakistan, but there are at least 4 countries, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, where we know that these types of raids have been carried out. Drones are now reportedly going to be involved again in the Libya situation and trying to root out whoever it was who was responsible for the attack on the U.S. ambassador there. It's still unclear whether that was sort of a spontaneous effort by local people or whether it was in fact a al-Qaeda plot. It seems like a I don't want to say lucky shot, but a pretty surprising thing for just a group of angry people to be able to pull off to kill the ambassador and several other U.S. people outside the consulate there, and to know that they were going to be arriving and so forth, and to have those weapons with them to do that. So my gut instinct is that it's probably a little bit more complicated than that, but we'll have to see what develops. But the president's willingness to endorse those kinds of aggressive tactics with the use of drones, and we even had the use of a drone in at least one instance to target an American citizen overseas, Anwar al-Awlaki, is another thing that has made him untouchable sort of on the national security issue, by Republicans. It's not that he's not open to criticism, he's just not particularly susceptible to the type of criticism that Republicans are likely to level. He's now being criticized by civil liberties groups. Occasionally you'll get some libertarians from the right who will criticize him, but it's mostly critics on the left who say that if you look back, for example, at the Democratic Party platform in 2008, there's a lot of discussion about excesses of executive power, that things need to be done through Congress. The president doesn't have all this authority to do these things by himself. If you look at the 2012 Democratic Party platform, all that discussion of excesses of executive power is gone. The discussion about closing Guantanamo Bay is still there, even though the president didn't mention it in his acceptance speech, but it's definitely toned down dramatically. And it's just kind of an insight as to how your perspective on these things changes when you're in office as opposed to when you're criticizing somebody who's not in office. So the president has come under attack on those issues as well, but he sort of, as I say, is in a position where Republicans cannot really lay a glove on him because many of them have advocated those types of aggressive policies for a long time, or even more so. So you've seen Governor Romney both today and previously trying to stake out positions where he could criticize the president on foreign policy and have a fair amount of difficulty with it. Why? Well, one area he's tried to criticize the president is on Afghanistan. That's another area where President Obama pursued a pretty aggressive policy. He actually surged troops there dramatically after coming in as largely an anti-war president who many people would argue won because of President Bush's unpopularity over the Iraq War. The president ordered a pretty dramatic surge of troops in Afghanistan. Mitt Romney has decided to criticize him over aspects of that policy, but has never really set out a coherent policy of his own. He's said that the president shouldn't have set a deadline to get out and things along those lines, but at other times he's endorsed the deadline. I think part of what's going on with Romney is that he's caught between two different elements of his own party. You have the Tea Party movement, which is mainly focused on budget issues and not so much on national security issues. But it's definitely not in favor of spending billions and billions of dollars overseas that don't need to be spent. And it's hard to imagine that there would be a lot of Tea Party members who would say, we're interested in sort of an open-ended commitment to war in Afghanistan for as long as it takes, for as much money as it costs, and with some sort of goal of, say, rebuilding the Afghan government. It's just hard to see how a Tea Party person would think that that's a wise expenditure of U.S. resources. On the other hand, the main line of the Republican foreign policy establishment thinks we should be involved more aggressively still in Afghanistan, that President Obama's decision to move towards winding down the war is a mistake, and that Romney should go after him on those issues, that he's politicizing this and we need to see through the fight, that President Obama needs to talk more about victory. And so Romney's kind of caught between these two different camps. As I said earlier, we thought we might get a little bit of an answer as to what direction he was headed in yesterday, but he deferred on us, saying it was a 9/11 anniversary and he didn't want to get into any more detail. I am expecting that when we have these presidential debates in about starting in a couple of weeks, and then there's 3 debates. At least one of them is supposed to be all foreign policy. One may be devoted about half to foreign policy. We'll see a lot of those issues fleshed out in more detail, but at the moment it seems like Romney is trying to sort of be all things to all people on these issues, because there are folks that are not satisfied with the president's performance on foreign policy or on the economy. But whenever Romney begins to get into specifics, there's the risk that those critics of the president don't agree with Romney, and then it doesn't actually net him much benefit. So I thought I would just discuss, since I am from Politico, some of the other issues that I think are kind of interesting that we're seeing play out in the election beyond the world of foreign policy. The map is kind of interesting to folks at the moment. You know, I think we see a lot of discussion of national polls, that the president and Governor Romney are neck and neck. And that's true, but political reporters will often tell you that, it's not a national election. We don't have popular voting in this country. We go state by state and electoral vote by electoral vote. So, to say that the two men are neck and neck really doesn't tell you very much. You have to drill down. And when you drill down, pretty much everyone in political circles in Washington seems to agree at the moment that the president is in a more solid position than Governor Romney, which is pretty amazing given the state of the economy being very lackluster. May have to do with aspects of Romney's performance as a candidate. But again, you're going state by state, so a lot of it has to do with the demographics of each state. A lot of it has to do with the issues in each state. Some places that you might have thought would be in great play or contention between the candidates really aren't because of local issues. States like Ohio and Michigan have been battlegrounds for some time and was thought they would really be in play. It really doesn't look like those states are in much play at the moment. That's attributed in large part to the auto bailout and the president's decision to move forward with sort of a government-oriented bailout of those auto companies, something that Mitt Romney disapproved of or had at least a different plan for, and had an unfortunate headline above his op-ed on the subject that said, "Let Detroit go bankrupt," which I think he would have probably preferred not to have almost any other headline than that on the piece, which didn't exactly say that. And his people point out, President Obama let those companies go bankrupt, and that's where a lot of this work was done in bankruptcy court. But it seems like one that Governor Romney is never going to be able to live down. If you go to other states, Florida, for example, that's another one that looked to be in real contention, but Governor Romney's selection of Paul Ryan as his running mate has again kind of reset that situation, and probably reset it in a way that benefits President Obama. Ryan's views on restructuring the Medicare program and sort of doing away with it as an entitlement in the long term are probably of some concern to the older voters in Florida, and seem to have contributed to the president seeming to open up some kind of lead there as well in a state that a lot of people thought, and certainly the Obama campaign was planning for the possibility of losing, and seeing if they could work around it with some combinations of other states. A couple other states that are kind of interesting, I think, are Colorado and Virginia, where I happen to live at the moment. There you're seeing, especially in Colorado, you have a lot of Latino residents, a growing Latino population and demographics. A lot of those demographics have yet to play out. It takes a long time. People think that if a Latino citizen becomes a voter at age 18, therefore that's how we judge what the political impact is going to be. But because young people tend to vote at much lower rates than older people, it actually takes almost a full generation for that effect to be felt. And so while you may hear a lot of discussion about Hispanics and Latinos coming to the fore in the election, some demographers that I've talked to have said, look, that's more of a time bomb effect that takes 10 or 20 or 30 years to develop. Even right now, it's only just beginning to be felt. And so while it may be true that Republicans are in an awkward position on some of those issues, it may or may not be felt in this particular campaign. I have covered immigration for the Politico as well, and there's no question that the president has made a series of moves in the last year, including this deferred deportation program, that are clearly designed to improve his standing with the Latino population that had been very upset with his failure to fulfill his promise to move forward on immigration reform in the first year of his presidency, and then basically not fulfilling that promise during the remainder of his term. And then Virginia, a subject that Skip and I were talking about just before we came in here, another fascinating state that was once sort of reliably Republican and seemed to be headed in a really conservative direction that seems to be changing pretty dramatically. It's hard to even know whether to classify it really as a solid part of the South anymore. There's been such a huge growth in the population in Northern Virginia, the outskirts of DC, some of it driven probably a little bit by the huge increase in Homeland Security contractors and all kinds of work related to the post 9/11 security world, there's just a dramatic increase in population in Northern Virginia and demographics of people moving from DC into Northern Virginia that are really changing the state dramatically in a way that seems to, by the polls, put Obama at least in contention of winning that again in 2012. The other thought that I wanted to leave you with is some of the factors that have nothing to do with necessarily electoral votes or policy that could actually play a pretty big role in this election. And when people ask me, well, what do you think will decide the election, you know, it would be tempting for me to say, well, it's going to be the president's foreign policy related to Guantanamo or whatever. I don't think that's the case. I don't think foreign policy is likely to drive the outcome of the election. I'm not even sure that the confidence in the president's economic policy is really going to drive the election. That's obviously the big picture issue that's out there right now, and it's the one that'll be in most voters' minds. But I actually think that the president's reelection is going to be driven in large part by more kind of intangible factors having to do with his 2008 campaign and how much of that he's able to bring back in 2012. You know, in 2008, he was not really a candidate. He was really a cultural phenomenon. It was kind of a juggernaut that people, especially young people, jumped on board of. He was, you know, there were songs being made about him, there were videos being made about him. A lot of that material broke through in channels of people that never, ever in a million years read Politico and very rarely would watch the network news and probably don't watch much of the local news and are just not tuned into politics. But the president was able to pick up, the future president was able to pick up the interest of a lot of people who have tuned out politics for obvious reasons that many of us can think of. And he was really able to tap into those folks. And so I think a big part of the factors that will resolve this election has to do with how much of that the president can rekindle this time around. There's a little bit of data to support that. If you look at the last ABC Washington Post poll that came out just a couple of days ago, the president was ahead of Governor Romney 50% to 44% among just regular voters. But when they tried to figure out who was likely to turn up at the polls, the president was only ahead by 1%, 49 to 48. And this gap has sort of persisted for the last few months or through the last year. In other words, if you just ask the average guy on the street, the president seems to have the margin to win. If you ask the people who are actually considered likely to turn up at the polls, it seems to be almost dead even. And to me, what that means is that the voters that were really activated in 2008 are either not activated this year or on the fence, or at least that those are the people that are in play. And if you look carefully at what's been going on for the last couple months, there's been a lot of efforts by the Obama campaign and the Obama White House to reach those people that don't pay any attention to politics. I don't know about the Little Rock paper, but I know that the New York Times and the Washington Post had the picture of the guy bear hugging the president in a sports bar and lifting him off his feet above the fold in the front, in the middle of the paper on the front page. And you may say, oh, that's like funny, and you know, isn't it weird that somebody would do that with the president? But I do think it's images like that. It's even things as silly as the kiss cam of the president and his wife kissing at a sporting event in Washington. Things like that that take on a viral presence on social media that, as I say, reach a lot of these people that are not terribly engaged in the issues and not terribly interested in politics, that are designed to sort of, I don't want to say designed, but I think the president's people hope can rekindle some of the energy, some of the cool that he had in 2008. And I really think if he can get a significant number of those people who had never voted before, either because they're young or because they were tuned out of politics, to turn up in November, he will be reelected fairly easily. If he can't get that energy back at all, or if there are events in the world that make it really hard for him to make those kinds of appeals to people, I think he's going to have a very difficult time getting over the finish line, and it's going to be a much, much closer election. So those are some of my general thoughts. Since we're in the heat of the campaign, I'm sure people have a lot of questions and subjects of their own that they want to talk about the campaign. I'm also willing to entertain questions about reporters covering the campaign and political coverage and Politico and the media world if people are interested in talking about those things as well.
Great question right here, and please wait for the microphone.
There was a great deal made recently of media outlets getting quotes vetted by campaigns. What, if any, agreements did Politico make or not make, and where do you stand on that?
I don't think Politico has a policy per se. There's no reporter who would want to do that. If people don't know what the question is about, there's been a bit of a controversy in the last couple months in Washington in reporting circles about a practice that a lot of people in the administration, and I think other people as well, have been using, where they'll do an interview with reporters but say you can't quote anything in it without like emailing the quotes to them later, and then they'll either say if you can use it or you can't use it. They may then try to change it. You know, the problem with that practice is that once one person asks to do that, there's really no reason that every person can't ask to do it. Or what ends up happening is the sophisticated people will all ask for that kind of treatment, and it's only the poor schmo that gets interviewed that doesn't know what's going on, who won't know that they can ask for that. We don't have a specific policy. I mean, one of the problems is it's just a very difficult problem to fix. I mean, if you say, we're only going to do things on the record and we're not going to ever do anything off the record, you just won't get the real inside information about what's happening. You can take that stance, and at different times, different news organizations have tried to do that, but it's just very hard to get people to speak candidly about what's going on unless you're willing at certain times to grant them some sort of anonymity. In terms of the approval problem, what you'll have then, and if you agree with that premise, then everyone will just say, well, we'll just do this on background, or I'll only talk to you off the record. So then, having talked to you off the record, you know, you're naturally going to want to say, can I use some of this on the record? And then you're basically back in the same position where you're trying to get approval for the interviews. So it's not something that I like to do or want to do. It's not something that I would do very often. But you know, it does lead to things being sort of stage managed and ironed out to the degree where it's hard to get an accurate beam on what people are saying. But I'm not sure that, I've yet to hear any proposal that would really fix the situation in a way that might not actually be worse and lead to people getting less information. I mean, that is not to say that we don't have some rules about how stuff that's not attributed to people should be handled. And I think most news organizations say that you shouldn't allow people to level allegations, especially personal allegations, at somebody else, unless they're willing to put their name behind it. So we try to avoid that. We try to put as much stuff on the record as we can. But the reality is, for example, if you want to do a story about what Republican strategists really think about how Mitt Romney's doing, you're just not going to find many prominent Republican strategists who will speak to you on the record saying they have doubts about the way he's handled this most recent situation. But in fact, it may be the case that 90% of them have doubts about how he's handled the most recent situation. So at Politico, we do try to convey that kind of information to people, and I think sometimes it's simply a necessity for us to have people speak on background or to just describe who they are without necessarily giving their names.
Yes, Steve. Yeah, you have a question right here. Yes, ma'am.
Regarding the situation in Libya and Egypt, I heard today that the maker of the anti-Muslim film is the minister from Kansas that's been so much in the public eye the last few years. Can you confirm if that's true, and if so, any comments you might have?
My understanding is it's not true that he's not the maker of the film, but that he had said that he was interested in showing the film at his church or something like that. So he's sort of embraced the film. I mean, I do think that, even before we knew that he was connected to this film, I immediately thought back to that incident, and it seems like a very similar situation. We have freedom of speech in the United States where people can say the things that they want to say, by and large. And, it's just very hard to be able to tell a private citizen who wants to make a movie or burn a Quran that, like, he can't do that if that's really something that he wants to do. I do know that today, I believe the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staffs, Martin Dempsey, called, I think, that pastor and urged him not to show the film. You have the free speech concerns on one side. On the other hand, it's, I think, no coincidence that the administration would use the chairman of the Joint Chiefs to reach out to this person, because the reality is you have a lot of military people and a lot of diplomatic people who work for the United States in harm's way if something like this becomes a conflagration. And it's a very difficult thing to balance. I actually didn't think, Romney's statement seemed to overshoot the mark, the one that he issued overnight where he called it disgraceful that these people at the embassy in Egypt had sent out statements or tweets saying that they didn't endorse or condemned the stuff in this film. I think it overshot the mark because, as President Obama said today in this CBS interview, those people were, at one point, they were under attack. Before that, they were under sort of an imminent threat of attack. And if they didn't form their words or their rhetoric exactly correctly, it seems like something that could probably be forgiven under the circumstances rather than immediately condemned. That said, I don't think that it's the case that Romney has no area to work in here. The president has sometimes, I think, not been terribly forceful about speaking out for the free speech side of this equation. When he made his statement this morning, he didn't mention anything about that. And so it turns out in the CBS interview, which I was just reading before I came out here, he did talk about that, and he said that he would defend people's right to free speech and that he has to uphold the Constitution, and that's something he's sworn to do. But at the same time, we don't endorse what's being said in this film. The Romney position seems to be that the U.S. government shouldn't pass judgment on what private citizens are saying. I think that Romney could also, for example, instead of what he said, have said something like, we have religious freedom in this country and we have freedom of speech. The religious freedom means that if you're Muslim and you want to build a mosque near ground zero, even if it upsets people and hurts their feelings, you're entitled to do that. And the freedom of speech means if you want to make a film about Muslims that offends them and upsets them, you're entitled to do that. Both things you may decide you don't want to do after people tell you how much it's going to hurt their feelings, but you have the right to do them. It doesn't mean it's wise to do them. And that would be a slightly different emphasis from the way Obama handled the situation. It's not that surprising to me that Obama took the tack he took, because frankly, if this were to spread and there were to be dozens of diplomats killed or hundreds of military people killed, there would be a lot of second guessing about his words. And so I can understand why, I don't want to say conservative, but he would be a little bit more conservative in his comments. The challenger always tends to be a little bit more out there on national security issues than the incumbent does, and that's something we saw even from President Obama when he was a candidate in 2008.
Questions? Got a question?
Can you talk a little bit about, I guess, what one point of view would call voter suppression, others would call voter fraud prevention? Do you think that's going to have much of an impact on this election?
It's hard to say. If the election is really close, it could have some impact. There are, as people may know, there's a lot of state legislatures have passed voter ID laws in the last couple of years. Many of them were designed to go into effect for this election. Either the courts or the Justice Department or some combination thereof have blocked some of them from taking effect in the states where states have to get advance permission to do that, which is not all of the states. I think it could have some impact, but it's very, very hard to tell. The voter fraud situation, the evidence that I've seen that there's sort of widespread voter fraud seems to be limited. I think the Justice Department has acknowledged that there is some voter fraud in the area of absentee ballots and has traditionally been a problem in some places. The weird part is that the voter ID legislation in almost all these places doesn't really affect the absentee ballot situation. It only affects people showing up in person. One of the problems has been that in some places people may not have the correct type of identification to meet these requirements. In Texas, I know, for example, they had a very odd list of what kind of ID would be acceptable and what wouldn't, that excluded, allowed pretty much all state-issued ID except for student IDs to be accepted. So, you know, I think it could have some impact. As I was saying before, I think a lot of the election is going to ride on the less motivated voters who came out in 2008, who tend to be young or somewhat disaffected from the political system, and whether they decide to turn out again in 2012. And some of those people are the ones who could potentially have problems. I do think that if it really came to a situation where those laws held the balance of the election, you would see a pretty big kind of conflagration a la Florida in 2000, because these people are, in many cases, may still go to the polls, and if they're told they can't vote, it's going to be a messy situation.
Going back to the Libya situation and Governor Romney's response, last week Governor Romney caught a lot of flack from conservative commentators about not being aggressive enough. Do you think he formulated his response to the attack in Libya to maybe placate some of the flack from his own side?
Well, I think the main factor was that they were eager to play in this news cycle. I mean, 9/11 was 9/11. Now we have this big incident that's happened that's going to dominate the news, not just today, but probably for several days. We have 50 some odd days to go until the election. I think their feeling is they just cannot sacrifice playing in that arena in some way, shape, or form. I do think that when he had to decide, for example, this morning, does he double down on what he said last night or his campaign said last night, or does he try to back off of it? There's probably a calculation that backing off in any significant way would cause more grief for him than it's worth. You have those people on the right that were already a little bit suspicious of him for not being more aggressive on some of these issues, for not mentioning Afghanistan, for example, in his Republican National Convention acceptance speech, and looking for him to be more detailed and a little bit more combative, if you will, on the foreign policy issues. And if he had retreated, having said what he said overnight, those people would have given him no end of grief. So I think there was probably just a decision that it was better to sail forward on the course that they were set on and take whatever flack they were going to take for what was said, rather than reverse course and then look like a waffler to many people and be denounced by the foreign policy establishment in your own party. That's my guess of what the calculation was.
Denver's got a question right over here. Wait for the microphone.
Hey,
Welcome back to Little Rock.
thank you so much.
Two quick ones. I'd like to hear your observations on Secretary Clinton's role as our nation's chief diplomat in a world of WikiLeaks, Twitter, and Facebook and social media. And then two, your observations on President Clinton's role in the campaign, both with the convention last week and going forward, and what kind of impact his presence may have on the campaign.
On Secretary Clinton, I probably have to defer, because my wife actually works at the State Department in a women's office there, so it probably wouldn't be the wisest for me to just opine on how I think she has done across the board, generally speaking. As for President Clinton, you know, I think the speech that he gave at the Democratic National Convention was, you know, better received than President Obama's speech. President Obama seems to have tried to take that in good humor and take advantage of this. I still get a sense that there's not a deep personal bond or a natural connection between President Obama and President Clinton. And there were, you know, those difficult periods during the last campaign when some pretty negative things were said by the Obama campaign about President Clinton, and in an area where I think he felt he had always been a leader for the country in the area of race relations and stuff. So I'm not without taking a position one way or another on whether those things should have been said, I'm not surprised that he may never be completely, he may never, his sense of being aggrieved by some of those things may never dissipate completely. That said, it does seem that he's relishing his role in this election, President Clinton is. And one of my colleagues just last night was out at some of his campaign events and then came back to find that President Clinton holding forth in the lobby of the hotel on various subjects with a few reporters at some length. So, you know, he is someone, I covered him for 4 years, and you were there for some of that, and he is someone who just so loves politics and being in the mix of things, and I think that he's enjoying his role in the current campaign. And I think, you know, he's someone who helps President Obama deliver part of his message, probably to people that might not always be that receptive to the way the Obama administration has tried to deliver it. It's similar in a way to what the role Vice President Biden, I think, was able to play at the convention in trying to establish a connection with blue-collar voters and blue-collar types that President Obama may not have the most natural, having, you know, been a law professor and so forth, may not have the most natural connection with people in that part of society, but Biden does, and certainly in his years, President Clinton always was able to maintain that. So I think he's playing a useful role. You know, I would also say, though, that sometimes our memories of that period get a little gauzy over time, and so there's an element of nostalgia here where people seem to think that everything was wonderful and milk and roses in those days, and it's not exactly the way I remember it.
Yeah, right here. Go ahead.
You mentioned in your speech the divisiveness in the GOP over the issue of foreign policy, and I was wondering how present you thought that was, if anywhere, in other realms.
In what other realms?
Yeah.
I think in other realms they tend to be more cohesive, but that Romney faces the same kind of problem. Let me try to explain what I mean by that. I think in other realms the problem is that the swing voters that Romney is trying to win over and the Republican Party orthodoxy are not in sync. So if you talk about, for example, the health care, just before this recent situation in Libya and Egypt, the last thing that Romney had said that had upset the folks in the Republican Party orthodoxy was his comments about health care, that he was interested in keeping parts of, or he liked parts of President Obama's health care reform legislation and would try to keep them in place. Or maybe he didn't word it exactly that way, but he liked aspects of it, and his plan would include some of the things that Obama's plan did. That immediately set off alarm bells with folks in the Republican Party who said he shouldn't have said that, and he specifically, I think, said pre-existing conditions. He was interested in doing something to make sure that insurance companies had to cover you if you had a pre-existing condition, and that caused folks at Heritage and elsewhere to fly off the handle, and then his campaign walked it back. But it's a similar but slightly different problem, because there you're talking about a policy that's very popular with the moderate voters, but one that's not popular with the Republican establishment. And he's trying to walk that line, knowing that he needs to get his voters to the polls, but also needs some of these moderates in the middle. One thing we didn't mention, I mentioned a demographic of Latino or Hispanic voters. We didn't mention probably the most important demographic divide in this election, which is the gender divide between men and women, with just an enormous gap, depending on state by state, but I think it's between 15-20% gap between men and women, with Romney being down 15 to 20% with women. And some of these are issues where the polls tend to show that women are looking for a bit more of a compassionate response from government, even if they're not 100% signed on with what Obama did, or think it might have gone over the top, or think it may have contributed to the economic downturn, it's going to be hard to explain to some of those people that, why we shouldn't guarantee some type of insurance for pre-existing conditions.
Question back row. Right back there, yes, sir.
Thank you. I'm a faithful reader of Playbook and follow, obviously, Politico. I wonder if you could kind of talk about the inside on Politico itself, how you first came to it, and the role that it's playing in the evolving media world.
Sure. I didn't come to it at the very beginning. I arrived a couple years after it started, so I started in 2009, about a week before President Obama took office. But I've known the people that started it for years before that, especially John Harris, who's one of the co-founders, and Mike Allen, who I'd known from my days covering the White House for ABC, the Clinton White House. Politico has done, in my view, a tremendous job at finding a niche to cover and covering the heck out of it, and turning that into a really successful business model at a time when many, many other media companies, the vast majority of media companies, are really struggling to survive. And I think they managed to do that because it is a niche. We're very focused. It's not from the era of conglomerates that have their hands in a million different pots. We don't cover sports. We don't cover school committee meetings. We don't cover city council meetings. By and large, we don't cover international affairs that are entirely disconnected from U.S. politics. So a lot of the things you would see in a major metropolitan newspaper like the Washington Post, the New York Times, or the LA Times, we don't cover. We cover national politics. Now, we cover a lot of other subject areas sort of under that. We do tech and energy and a variety of policy areas where people on Capitol Hill are making policy. But we don't view it as a mandate to cover everything under the sun. And especially in a constrained economic time, Politico's been able to focus on that and be profitable doing that. The other part of it is we have a very targeted audience, and I don't want to offend people in Little Rock or any other part of the country that read Politico on a regular basis. We welcome people to do that. But from an advertising point of view, we tell advertisers that we are delivering a very specific audience. And you have other people in the media marketplace that are trying to tell you, we can give you 200,000 eyeballs, we can give you 500,000 eyeballs, we can give you a 2.3 million rating for this show or whatever. That's not the game that we're playing. We're telling people at the White House read Politico 4 times, 6 times a day. The major staffers on Capitol Hill and the cabinet agencies, members of the cabinet, they or their staffs are on Politico on a daily basis. If you're interested in reaching them, you need to come to us. And people are willing to pay a premium to reach that audience that they're not willing to pay to just send out random internet ads into the ether that are going to who knows where somebody just happens to be connected to the internet. So that business model of picking a niche and then having an audience that advertisers are interested in reaching and willing to pay a premium for is where Politico has thrived. And then the other part of it is, I think some of the other news organizations have ceded a little bit of space to us because they've been struggling so much trying to be all things to all people. And that's sort of my detached analysis. I don't want to really, I'm not celebrating anything that's happening to Metro newspapers because I've worked many years for newspapers and I think that they're vital to the communities that they serve. But the reality of the situation is that they're struggling economically and trying to find their way.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a round of applause. And y'all can come up and ask me questions. Let me just say from a personal perspective, I'm enjoying your visit in 2012 a lot more than I did in 2000. Ladies and gentlemen, John.
Thank you.